Kia ora koutou katoa. I am Satyamitra Ashok at Risk New Zealand, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our May 2020 Lunchtime Seminar. I hope all of you and your families are doing well and keeping safe in your bubbles, and that you have all settled well into level 3. Hopefully it will be level 2 soon and a little closer to business as usual. If you have been with us before, you know that our lunchtime seminars run on the first Tuesday of most months, featuring different speakers, and remains one of Risk New Zealand's most popular events. I would like to thank and acknowledge the support of RiskNZ's partners who make this possible. Our premier partner, Marsh, our crisis management partner, F24, our key lunchtime seminar partners, SAI Global and Safety Associates, our lunchtime seminar supporters, which are our venues across the country, KPMG, Watercare, Navigatus, Christchurch City Council, and PowerCo. Today, Risk New Zealand's lunchtime seminar is being delivered only as a webinar. All participants are on mute, but please feel free to type your questions straight into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screens at any time during the session. Our speaker will answer your typed questions at the end of our presentation. If you are joining us via a telephone and not on a computer, then unfortunately you won't be able to ask a question during the seminar. You can send any questions later to adminofficer@risknewzealand.org.nz, and we will endeavour to have them answered by the speaker at the earliest. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker. Sheena Hunt has a PhD in parasitology from King's College London. She has worked in human health, particularly the prevention and control of infectious disease, for more than 25 years. She is a consultant to many global clients, including pharmaceutical, academic, and business organizations, providing advice on scientific strategy, publications, communications, education, and clinical trial design, execution, and reporting. Her infectious disease experience includes research into many human pathogens, including seasonal and pandemic influenza, other respiratory viruses, dengue fever, yellow fever, multi-drug resistant bacteria, parasitic diseases, and invasive fungal infections. She has recently been part of a USA-based global team setting up a clinical trial in patients hospitalized with COVID-19. Today, Sheena will be giving us an overview of coronaviruses past and present. I would like to especially thank you, Sheena, for inviting us into your home for this seminar. Over to you.
Thank you, Sathya. And thank you to everyone who's come along to listen today. As Sathya mentioned, I've spent most of my professional life working on infectious diseases, including parasites. You've got a schistosome here, invasive fungal infections here and here. I've also included a picture of influenza, yellow fever, and a couple of bacterial infections here, including Helicobacter. But I have to say it's been an entirely new experience for me working on a clinical trial for a new virus during a pandemic that it has caused. It's not only been an incredibly steep learning curve, but also the landscape is changing every day. Every single day there are new publications and new data available. It's been incredibly hard to keep up. And what I have to say is, talking to you today, that information is up to date today, but it's continually changing. We're continually getting new data and new information. So more data is going to come out, and yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. So today I hope I can give you some interesting insights into this virus that has changed our lives so much. So today I want to talk to you about past and present pandemics so that you can build a picture that this is not new and this is not unexpected. I want to talk about COVID-19 in the context of other coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS, and also the coronaviruses that just cause mild infections. I'll briefly look at what's on the horizon in terms of a vaccine or treatments for COVID-19. And I'll also touch on seasonal influenza and the very real threat of pandemic influenza, which we mustn't forget about. So first of all, apologies for this very busy slide. The details of the diseases aren't really important. The key message here is that there is a big engine running in the background around the world to protect us from infectious disease. So in that 7 to 8 year period, the WHO was tracking almost 1,500 epidemic events around the world. Now, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board is made up of political leaders, heads of agencies, and experts. And in September 2019, they produced this report, including this graph. And they also said that the world is not prepared for a fast-moving, virulent respiratory pathogen pandemic. And it's so interesting that they produced this just 4 months before coronavirus emerged. While a global response is clearly critical, national responses are also crucial, and that has been so clear with the differing national responses that we've seen to this pandemic. And while national responses are led by government, organisations and individuals also need to get involved and be on board in terms of preparedness and response. So I just want to talk a little bit about pandemics, past and present, and if we look at the road going back in time, back to the year zero at the top, all the way down to today. The first pandemic that we know about is the Antonine Plague, probably caused by smallpox or measles, which was brought to the Roman Empire from troops returning from what is now the Middle East. And back in 165 AD, that killed around 5 million people. So the figures in red are the number of deaths caused by each pandemic. We then had the plague of Justinian, which was caused by Yersinia pestis, which is the first of the 3 plagues caused by this bacterium, which also caused the Black Death bubonic plague. Now, this bacterium is carried in infected fleas on rats, and rats would spread around, and then the fleas would jump off the rats and bite people, and that's how the infection spread. And the bubonic plague, which everyone has heard of, wiped out, I think, 1/3 of the world's population in sort of 1347 to 1351. It was absolutely astonishing plague, and it originated in Central Asia, but very rapidly spread to Italy and then throughout other European countries. Smallpox killed a lot of people in a large pandemic in around 1520, and there have been other smaller pandemics and outbreaks of smallpox. This is officially eradicated in 1980, but it was eliminated in most developed countries in the 1950s. We've got a 3rd plague by Yersinia pestis in 1855, and then in 1918 we have the first of the influenza pandemics, and everybody knows about this one, called the Spanish flu. It wasn't actually Spanish. Interestingly, it emerged in Asia and spread to Europe. But because there was a world war on, neither Germany nor the Allies wanted to admit that any of their troops had influenza or were weakened in any way. Spain was not involved, and so they admitted that there was a problem. So it looked, if you looked at newspaper headlines, it looked as if Spain was the only country that had the flu. So it was called the Spanish flu. Now, H1N1 refers to the subtype of the flu. The H and the N refer to glycoproteins on the surface of the flu called hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. That's not particularly important. What's important is that we've got these subtypes of flus with different N's and H's. Now, within a subtype, you can also have a number of different strains. So, for example, H1N1 also caused swine flu, which I'll talk about later. And while it's the same subtype, it's a different strain. So that's an important clarification. Asian flu emerged in 1957 and caused a pandemic killing around 1 million people, followed just 11 years later by another flu, H3N2, and that subtype exists today and is still circulating every year. SARS and MERS weren't pandemics, and that's really important to note, but I've put them on this chart just to put them into context. SARS only killed 770 people, which is not a lot compared to all these other flus. Then we had swine flu, which is our most recent pandemic until COVID-19, and that was a relatively mild pandemic. And I think the fact that it was mild has meant that I think people got a bit complacent because it wasn't as serious as previous pandemics have been. Then we had MERS in 2012, and then of course we've got COVID-19, which emerged in 2019 but was declared a pandemic in 2020. In 2019, the World Health Organization listed the top 10 threats of 2019, and you can see that the 2 of the top 10 are to do with pandemics. So we've got a global influenza pandemic and also Ebola and other high threat pathogens, which includes coronaviruses. There are 3 others in yellow here, which refer to viruses, and then the one in green with antimicrobial resistance, not just antibacterial resistance, but also antiviral resistance. So out of the top 10 threats, the World Health Organization, 6 of them are to do with infectious diseases. Before I move on, interestingly, the World Economic Forum considered pandemics in the top 19 risks in 2007 and 2008, but they haven't been included since. According to the World Economic Forum, infectious disease is, in 2020, is the 10th highest risk in terms of impact, but it wasn't included in the top 10 of likelihood of risks. Now, this is probably down to the fact that the other risks on their list, such as climate action failure and cyber attacks and water crises, were perhaps more easily predicted. So I'll just talk to you a little bit about coronaviruses now in general. There are 7 coronaviruses that we know infect humans. There are 4 that are benign, and that just means that they don't cause particularly severe disease. We have learnt to live with them, we adapt with them, we sadly come to work and go to school with them, and they affect all ages all around the world. It's just your classic common cold, around a week long, and although there's very occasional spread to worsening illness in at-risk individuals such as older people or people with respiratory problems, in general, they really don't cause very much problem at all. It seems that these coronaviruses come around every 2 to 3 years, and while they are considered epidemics, there's no publicity around them because they're just not that bad. Then we get on to the highly pathogenic coronaviruses that, of course, we all know about. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, and MERS, Middle East respiratory syndrome, and of course, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. Now, in this presentation, just to clarify, SARS-CoV-2 is the virus and COVID-19 is the disease that it causes. So when I'm talking about the virus, I'll talk about SARS-CoV-2, but if I'm talking about the disease, then it's COVID-19. This second timeline, I just want to show you how coronaviruses have become more frequent over time. So in the middle section here, we have the date from sort of today back to the 1100s. And then in the bottom section, I'll show you when the benign infections came about. And then in the top purple section, I'll show where the highly pathogenic infections came around. Now, it took sort of 700-800 years for the first 3 coronaviruses to emerge, the first one being 500 to 800 years ago. Now, these coronaviruses are all still in circulation. This is just when they actually emerged into humans. Then 16 years ago, SARS emerged, closely followed by another benign virus, which interestingly is benign, but is slightly worse than the other three. Very closely followed by MERS, and then of course SARS-CoV-2, which emerged about 4 months ago. So we had 800 years for the first three, and then 4 in the last 16 years. They're clearly becoming more frequent, and why is this? Well, the key is to do with zoonotic infections. A zoonotic infection is one that has come from an animal into a human, and most emerging viruses come from animals. So HIV emerged from chimps, Ebola and coronaviruses have emerged from bats, and influenzas emerge from birds. It's actually estimated that viruses such as Ebola, HIV, TB, and rabies cause approximately 2 billion cases of human illness and 2 million deaths each year. And very interestingly, while we have about 260 viruses known to humans, this is all viruses that infect humans, there are at least 1.6 million viruses known, estimated in birds alone. So what is clear is that there's this vast reservoir of viruses in animals, and we have only had a fraction of them emerge into humans. Now, why do viruses spill over from animals into humans? And this is a direct result of our actions involving wildlife and their habitat. Wet markets, for example, which are shown in this picture, they are unique epicenters for transmission of potential viral pathogens. You have alive animals, dead animals, different species, diseased animals, all together with humans. You've got this huge melting pot of viruses where new genes can be acquired or existing genes can mutate. You've got close proximity of different animal species and close proximity to humans. And through various mechanisms, it just seems that the viruses can jump into humans at these places. Also, in certain countries, farmers live with animals. Sick animals aren't always culled, and even when they are culled, they aren't disposed of correctly. Of course, you've got population density increasing and also destruction of wildlife habitat, which just means that animals and humans are coming into closer and closer contact. I want to talk a little bit about bats. They are, in 2004, it was discovered that bats are the natural reservoir for coronaviruses. They have many numbers of coronaviruses, and as I said, only 7 have jumped into humans. Bats are an ancient species, around 52 million years old, with more than 1,200 species, which is more than 25% of all mammalian species. They have a very special immune system. Because they have to fly, they have developed with no bone marrow, which means that they have no B cells which fight infection. So they have an extraordinary ability to tolerate infections with viruses that would be lethal in other mammals. And while they do seem to have a response to some viruses, they don't always. And in some viruses, there's just no immune response at all, and they just seem to be able to live with them. They live for a very long time, they're very social, and they're highly mobile. And while bats and humans may not mix that much, bats do mix with other animals. And so what will often happen is you'll get bats infecting animals. And this is where I'll move on to intermediate hosts for human coronaviruses. So the purpose of this slide is to show that bats don't always infect humans. Sometimes there needs to be a reservoir for the virus. And when I talk about a reservoir, I don't mean that a bat infects an animal and then that animal infects a human. What normally happens is a bat will infect an animal, and then that will become common in that animal population. So for SARS, it was the civet cat, and civet cats today still have SARS virus in them. Not all of them, obviously, but SARS is still in the civet cat population. MERS emerged through dromedary camels. And while there's a lot of uncertainty around how humans were first infected with SARS-CoV-2, there are a lot of theories and a lot of conspiracy theories, but it looks like the pangolin is still looking like the most likely culprit. There was some talk of it possibly being a snake, but I think that the viruses isolated from pangolins are most similar to the ones that eventually infected humans. Just very, very briefly want to talk about SARS, which emerged in 2002. And I'm sure most of you will remember how there was a significant effect on travel and national responses. There was an extraordinary response by the countries involved. It first involved in China, rapidly spread to Hong Kong and Thailand and Canada, where there was an outbreak, reacted incredibly quickly with all the things we've heard of recently: rapid case isolation and contact tracing and quarantining, limitation of travel. And amazingly, they managed to end global transmission by July 2003. The only cases since July 2003 are a couple of laboratory accidents and also contact with civet cats, which I mentioned before still have SARS in their populations. Going on to MERS, emerged in Saudi Arabia in around 2012. And this is ongoing. MERS hasn't been eradicated or eliminated. But the really interesting thing about MERS is that it doesn't have great human-to-human transmission. Now, I'm sure a lot of you recently have been reading a lot about the R0 of COVID-19. Now, the R0 is the basic reproductive number, which is the number of cases generated by one person with the disease. So how many people does one person infect? Now, with MERS, it was less than 1. It was between 0.3 and 0.8. So for every person with the disease, less than one other person was becoming infected. And that's why MERS hasn't exploded to the extent that we've seen with COVID-19. To put this into context, measles, for example, has an R0 of 18, so huge. Influenza in 1918 was around 3, and SARS was between 2 and 5, whereas COVID-19 is the median is around 5.7. So it's quite contagious, and this is what initially made it so much worse than, for example, MERS. I won't go too much into how SARS-CoV-2 emerged and COVID-19, because I'm sure you're also well aware and really saturated with that information. But it's really interesting that from the 27th of December, when it was first reported to authorities, within a month, you've got Wuhan city shut down, the WHO declaring a public health emergency, and within just sort of 6 weeks after that, the WHO declaring a pandemic. Right at the start of the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, even before it was declared a pandemic, a lot of people and a lot of social media and a lot of newspapers were saying, oh, it's just the flu, it's just a cold, it's not that bad, a lot of people don't get that sick. But it became very clear very rapidly that it isn't just the flu. Now, this is quite a complicated graph, but I just want to explain it. So this graph is from Euromomo, which is the European Mortality Monitoring Activity Group, and it covers 24 European countries and around 350 million people. And what it shows is by year, 2016, 17, 18, and 19, the weekly number of deaths over time. So for all years, there were more deaths in winter than in summer, and that's quite normal from respiratory infections and also people with heart disease. You can see that the years vary. 2017 obviously had a very, very bad year. 2018 had a hump there. But this shaded area here, that's the normal range of deaths between 2009 and 2019 when you put all the aggregates together. When you add 2020, you can see that we were tracking in Europe, this is down sort of normally. This was looking like the end of a winter, not such a bad winter in Europe. And then around mid to end of February, suddenly the number of deaths just shot up. And these excess deaths are attributed to COVID-19. And this is out of date now. This was stopped in April. And obviously the deaths in Europe have rocketed even more since then. So a model of the WHO Collaborating Centre estimated that if we had done nothing, and I'm talking about no population measures, no controls, no isolations, then in the absence of interventions, COVID-19 would have resulted in pretty much the whole population of the globe being infected and 40 million deaths this year alone, which is just a terrifying figure. Let's look at how New Zealand has done. So this model shows, we've got the orange line, which shows what was predicted with a lockdown simulation. And up to this point here, I think it was the 5th of April, these were actual values. And as you will remember from watching the cases every day, we've actually done better than this. And then the purple line shows an estimation of what might have happened if we hadn't had lockdown. So what is very clear is that New Zealand has done so well with testing, tracing, rapid case isolation, combined with these population-wide control methods. New Zealand, Vietnam, and Iceland have all done fantastically well, Australia as well, when you compare them to, for example, Spain, Italy, the UK, and the US, where numbers are still increasing significantly. One of the questions I get asked most, and I read so much in the press, is about a vaccine and why it's taking so long. So I just want to talk to you about how long a vaccine normally takes. And it's around 15 years. And actually for varicella and the first flu vaccine, it was 28 years. So normally vaccines take an extraordinarily long time to produce. I don't have time to go through the really complex clinical trials process. And even though clinical trials is really what I do, what's important to note is that from preclinical, which is the animal phase, which a lot of vaccines are in at the moment, to the phase 1 trials, which is where the COVID-19 trials are currently in, there's huge steps that have to be gone through before you get to approval, and then you've got distribution. So when people ask why is it taking so long, my question is how on earth can we do it in a short period of time? Anthony Fauci in the US said 18 months. And you can see, if we go back to here, how compressed we have to try and get a vaccine ready and available. And that's even by August 2021. Now, the other question is, will we have a vaccine? We don't know this yet. Do we develop immunity? How long does this last for? With SARS and MERS and other coronaviruses, we don't have good evidence of long-lasting immunity. But having said that, we also don't really have enough data to know. So we don't know enough about this disease to know whether we will have a vaccine yet. Now, so that's clear to me that we need to learn to live with this virus. We need to adapt to it over time, mitigate risks and harms, and keep looking for new therapies and treatments. Because while vaccination is absolutely the gold standard, we need medicines that can actually help people who are already sick with it, or to stop people who are in hospital from dying. So while we're hoping for a vaccine, and I'm hopeful for a vaccine, we need to be aware that it may not come. What's currently in the pipeline? Well, at least 150 experimental drug treatments are in clinical trials, and this was last week's figures, so it's probably even more by now. 8 candidate vaccines are in clinical trials, and then nearly 100 in preclinical evaluation. That's that very early phase I showed you in the slide before. There have been a few drug treatments that are looking promising. Hydroxychloroquine, which was touted as being the miracle drug early on from a very deeply flawed clinical trial, has been shown not to be the miracle drug it was hoped for. It's got dangerous side effects in very sick people, and it also using it has meant that people have not been able to try having other new treatments. So that does not seem to be promising anymore. And remdesivir is another drug that's looking promising, although there have been conflicting results. Some clinical trial has shown that it does reduce time to recovery, whereas another hasn't shown benefit. And I think it's really important to recognize that we just need more data. We still don't know enough. Even if drugs are looking promising in clinical trials, it doesn't mean that they're going to have good results in the vast majority of people. What's clear is that clinicians are probably going to want a number of antiviral drugs with different ways of disabling the virus. So you want different modes of actions. You want drugs you can use in different settings with different people with different comorbidities, heart disease, kidney disease, all those sorts of things. You also want to have first, second, third, fourth line therapy in case the first ones fail. So why would I want to talk about influenza during a COVID-19 pandemic? Well, unlike the Northern Hemisphere, who were coming out of the influenza epidemic, seasonal epidemic, we are just going into the influenza season now as we enter COVID-19. So the potential problems with seasonal influenza alongside COVID-19. First of all, you can potentially get co-infection. This hasn't been well documented, but there are case studies published, and the people who have had co-infection with both viruses have understandably been very sick indeed. Another of the problems is with diagnosis. So if you can imagine, in a month's time, you have a fever and chills and coughing and can't get out of bed, how will you know if it's seasonal influenza or COVID-19? We obviously don't want seasonal influenza to clog up hospital beds and use up healthcare resources that might be needed for COVID-19. And that's why the seasonal influenza vaccine is more important than ever this year. It's really important to remember that seasonal influenza can be really nasty. You've got 3 to 5 million severe cases globally and up to 650,000 deaths every year, and 100,000 deaths in children aged under 5. But when you look at these numbers, it's important to bear in mind, back to my earlier slide, that if COVID-19 had gone unchecked, then it could have killed 40 million people. So I just want to touch on the potential for an influenza pandemic now, because to be honest, that's what everybody was expecting. Everyone knew a pandemic was possible, but I think most scientists thought that it would be an influenza pandemic. And here's a selection of Time magazine articles from way as early as 2003, talking about the worry of avian flu and a pandemic influenza. So as I mentioned earlier, influenzas tend to come from wild birds. They are a natural reservoir for avian influenza viruses. Now, birds can infect other birds, such as poultry, ducks, and they can also infect other animals, such as pigs. Now, unlike bats, birds do get really sick. So the viruses that make birds very sick are called highly pathogenic avian influenzas. And humans can catch them. Doesn't normally infect humans, they're normally completely fine. But when you've got humans in close contact with infected or sick or dead poultry, then that's when you can get human infections. There is very little human-to-human transmission at this point. There's a public health threat exists if the virus or viruses gain the ability to transmit between people rather than just catching the virus from a chicken. So there are 2 influenza subtypes on the radar with significant numbers of human infections. Neither of them at this stage has sustained person-to-person transmission. So we've got H5N1, which has had about 900 cases with a really high 60% mortality rate, and H7N9 with still a very high 35% mortality rate. Now, it's important to note with both of these viruses, there has been human-to-human transmission, but this has been with very, very close contact, such as a mother looking after a sick child, incredibly prolonged close contact. So there's not general transmission. There are at least 9 other avian influenzas that have gone into humans, rarely, but they're being monitored. I want to talk a little bit about how a pig may act as an intermediate host, because it's quite important in terms of pandemic potential. Now, you'll remember that in 2009, the pandemic was called swine flu. Now, if you've got a chicken with an avian virus, for example, that was able to go into humans and into pigs, and then that virus was able to go from pigs into humans again. You might also have a human who's got an infection with a human virus that's just your normal seasonal influenza that's spreading around naturally. That human could infect a pig. Now, in that pig, you could, through genetic mixing and mutation, you could have a new influenza virus. Now, that new virus could potentially contain most of the genes from the human virus, for example, but it could also include some of the genes from the pathogenic avian influenza virus. So if, for example, you got a mixing of genetic information and you managed to get a virus that had the infectivity and transmissibility of the human virus, but the pathogenicity of the bird virus, and that is when you could actually get a pandemic occurring. If that virus gained the ability to spread easily from person to person, it has been estimated that a virus such as the one in with the same properties as the one in 1918, that virus would be able to kill 33 million people within 6 months. So this is the WHO's pandemic alert graph, which they use, and it's generally used for avian influenza. So for at the moment, H5N1, which was on a couple of slides ago, that's in the alert phase here. So at the moment we are in an alert phase for H5N1, but where are we for coronavirus? Nationally, obviously we're probably over the hump, or I hope we are, but where are we? Where's the globe in terms of being on this curve? A lot of scientists think that it's still far from over the worst. And we can't keep New Zealand locked down indefinitely. So what do we do to begin to reconnect? What is clear is that we aren't going to be able to go back to normal. We are ahead, but we can't avoid it. We need to prepare ourselves for a world with COVID-19 that we are connected to. So what are the changes then to our personal and professional working environments that will break the old habits and start a new way of doing things? For example, we have a very strong focus on health and safety that focuses on accidents in the workplace. But what about resilience and sustainability in terms of infectious disease in the workplace? What will organizations' obligations become to keep their workforce safe as possible? Up until now, it's been up to the individual to monitor how sick they are and whether to come to work. But 2 things are really important to bear in mind. That the first is that coronavirus is going to be with us for a long time, even if there's a vaccine. And the second is that we always need to be ready for a new pandemic. some kind of avian influenza, even if it's not H5N1, it could be another one. This is very unlikely that this will be the last pandemic we see in our lifetimes. Now, this is a quote from Anthony Fauci, you've probably seen him on the news. He's the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the US. I've put it here really to just start a dialogue. Just because we've always done something and it's normal practice doesn't mean we have to carry on doing it. So just as smoking, for example, is no longer tolerated in workplaces, what other common practices will change? I do wonder if perhaps not our children, but our children's children will think that it's revolting that we used to shake hands in the workplace. What other things are going to become unacceptable? You know, like being at work with a light cold, or being given just 5 days of sick leave. These kind of things might become outdated. On a personal level, you know, now it's not acceptable to be sick in public anymore, and people are taking far more responsibility. I think people are taking more responsibility for keeping themselves and their families safe from flu, and obviously as we move through alert levels, hopefully people are going to stay home when they're sick or their family members are sick. There's going to have to be more tolerance about people from working from home. Perhaps previously it has been slightly frowned on. I think this is going to have to become far, far more normal. And we're going to have to become more aware about our bubbles, our virtual bubbles. We're going to have to remember who we were in contact with. And will there be changes to traditional gatherings such as conferences and big work meetings, as well as social functions like weddings and other events? And we already know that people are far more aware of things like cough etiquette, hand hygiene, and avoiding close contact. So to sum it up, there was plenty of warning that there was going to be a pandemic. The uncertainty was around exactly when it would come and how bad it would be. And all organizations were carrying that risk, and now we're carrying the consequences. So what do we do going forward? Because we know COVID-19 will be around for a long time. There's so much talk about the new normal and what it will look like, and it really is just too early to tell. So much depends on whether a vaccine will be available, but that is by no means the only factor. What's really clear is that workplaces will change, and in too many ways to go into here, and in too many different ways, because each organization is going to be different. But just as organizations have got plans to be resilient for natural disasters such as earthquakes, we need to be more resilient in terms of emerging health threats. And I just want to end this by really urging you all to take the lessons we've learned and the changes that you make during this pandemic and keep them current. Ensure your organization is agile, and whether or not you keep these changes from alert level 2 and beyond post COVID-19, even if you don't keep them, that you're able to implement them again very quickly. There will be another pandemic, and probably in our professional lifetime. The next one may not be as bad as this one, or it may be a lot worse. But one thing's clear, that next time we need to be more ready. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope you found it useful. I'll answer some questions now, if any have come through. But if you have other questions, or you would like to have a discussion that's more specific to your organisation, please do get in touch. You can email me, or as Sathya said, you can always ask through Risk New Zealand. Okay, got some questions here. Okay. First question, you mentioned that humans interacting with animals, wet markets, etc. are factors. As humans continue to expand their footprint, do you have a view on what impact climate change will have in making diseases like COVID-19 more common? Yes, certainly climate change does have an effect, and I think not only in terms of changing animals' habitats and their landscape, I think climate change also has effect on viruses. The extent to which climate and temperature affects a virus depends on the virus. But yes, I absolutely do think that climate change will have an impact. Second question, is there any evidence that CoV-2 escaped from a virus lab in Wuhan? That's a very good question. First of all, I think there's no question that the virus was man-made. The virus absolutely came from a bat. It's possible that the Wuhan lab, which was studying bat coronaviruses, had a breach and a virus escaped, but it's very unlikely. And I think what's important to remember is that if you've got two possibilities, then it's Occam's razor. You'll go with the one that's more likely, and it's far more likely that it came from a wet lab, not a wet lab, a wet market. Sorry, it's possible it came from a lab, but I don't think so. Could you explain the terms infectivity, communicativity, and pathogenic? Infectivity just means how infective a virus is, and that's back to the R0 that I talk. How contagious is it? Communicativity, I don't think is a word I've used. Pathogenic means how sick it makes someone. So if a pathogen makes someone or an animal sick, and if it's highly pathogenic, it'll make you very sick. How long do you think NZ's borders will be closed or open with a 14-day quarantine? Gosh, I'm not an expert in that, and I don't know. I do think a trans-Tasman and a trans-Pacific bubble is possible and quite soon. As for the rest of the world, I don't know. I think that really depends on whether a vaccine becomes available. This is a good one. In time, COVID-19 may fade and organisations will become accustomed to the risk and then complacent. How do we keep a high awareness of the risk between pandemic periods? That's so important, and I don't know, and I think it's so essential. We just must. I don't know. Is it organisations talking to scientists more? Is it organisations having that education and communication strategy? I'd be really interested to talk about that, but it's absolutely essential. If antivirals and vaccines prove to be useless in fighting COVID-2 virus, should we embrace herd immunity? The problem with herd immunity is with an R0 of about 5.7, which is what COVID-19 has, you need about 82% of the population to be immune to have herd immunity to protect the at-risk. So we need a vast number of people to be infected to have herd immunity, and not only that, we don't know if people are immune. We may be immune briefly, we may be immune for a season, we may be immune for 2 to 3 years. So while herd immunity is a good term to use with vaccination, I've always struggled with it being used in actual live infections. From a risk perspective, we have always thought a pandemic was a 1 in 100 year event. How do you assess the risk going forward, e.g. 1 in 10 event of another significant pandemic? That's really interesting. Yeah, I think the 1 in 100 year event is not correct. We've had, since the 15th century, I think we've had 3 flu pandemics a year, and we've clearly had SARS, MERS and COVID-19 emerge in such a short period. And not so much with MERS, but SARS could have been so much worse had the countries not leapt on it like they did. So, oh gosh, I don't know. I would say 1 in 10 or less, definitely. I think, especially with the avian influenzas out there that are looking really worrying. And what is at risk? What is the risk of a second wave? That's a really good question. The 1918 flu pandemic had 3 big waves, and the second wave was by far the most fatal and caused most deaths. That there is a high risk of a second wave if countries don't keep on top of it. I think in New Zealand the risk of a second wave is much lower because of the way we have ring-fenced each of our infections. And someone said, sorry you broke up, what animal is believed to have caused COVID-19? And that was, it originated in bats, but then possibly emerged through an intermediate host, possibly a pangolin. Okay, so that's all the questions. I'll hand back over to you, Sathya.
Thank you very much, Sheena, for that wonderfully comprehensive presentation. It's an absolutely fascinating area, and we have learned a lot today, and thank you for answering all those questions as well. Thank you everyone for making the time to join us today. Please keep in mind that if you have more questions, you can direct them to Sheena at the email that she pointed out, or you can direct it to adminofficer.org.nz, and we'll try and get those answers to you as soon as we can. Risk New Zealand's Lunchtime Seminar series wouldn't be possible without the support of our great partners, so a shout out to them once again. Our premier partner Marsh, our crisis management partner F24, our key Lunchtime Seminar partners SAI Global and Safety Associates, and our wonderful venues around the country, KPMG, Watercare, Navigatus, Christchurch City Council, and PowerCo. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be shared with you soon. We will also be sharing it in the members area of the Risk New Zealand website. We intend to be back with more lunchtime seminars soon and look forward to welcoming you to more of Risk New Zealand's activities in the near future. Thank you. Take care. Kia kaha.